Okay, today we're going to talk about how gases are transported through the pulmonary system and the cardiovascular system for that. We'll start off talking about oxygen transport, and then we'll move into CO2, and eventually we'll talk actually about how acid-base balance is maintained by the pulmonary system. This is by far one of the more important graphs that you'll need to know for your next exam. This is called the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve, or the oxyhemoglobin saturation curve. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but just to tease you a little, it describes the sensitivity and relationship between the partial pressure of oxygen and how saturated or how much oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. Now we can bind oxygen to hemoglobin, or we can carry oxygen through the cardiovascular system in two ways. We can carry it bound to hemoglobin on the blood, and that accounts for about 98% of all of our oxygen carrying, but about 2% of that oxygen gets dissolved into the blood. So let's say we take a 100 milliliter sample of blood. We draw it out just like at the doctor's office, and then we put it in a centrifuge to separate out the different parts. About 42% of your blood, 42 to 45, 46, somewhere around there, is going to be red blood cells, which the main feature of the red blood cells is hemoglobin. The hemoglobin carries a lot of the oxygen. So 98% of our oxygen is going to be in the red blood cells and bound to hemoglobin. We have white blood cells, which aren't really going to carry oxygen, but we have about 2% that gets dissolved in the blood. Think about how carbon dioxide gets dissolved in your soda. That's kind of what's going on there with the plasma. So we have oxygen getting dissolved into the blood. Now we can calculate how much oxygen is being carried by the blood with this formula on the top here. This formula stands for the content. So the C is content. And then the little a, anytime you see a little a or lowercase a is arterial. So this is how we look at how much oxygen, O2, is contained in arterial blood. Now we could do a very similar formula where instead of having little a's, we just have little v's. Lowercase v's is venous. And so the whole formula would be exactly the same. You just enter values obtained from venous blood. So let's focus on arterial blood now. So the CaO2, the content of oxygen in arterial blood, it can be calculated by drawing some blood. Let's say 100 milliliters is usually a standard. So we're going back to this 100 milliliters. So you draw 100 milliliters of blood, and then you look at how much is bound to hemoglobin and then how much is dissolved in the plasma. So let's calculate how much is bound to hemoglobin. First off, we need to know how much hemoglobin is in that sample. So we measure how many grams of hemoglobin are in our 100 milliliters of blood. And so that's the concentration, grams per 100 mils or grams per deciliter. And so we measure the concentration of hemoglobin, and then we multiply that by this constant. So if all of our hemoglobin is binding oxygen, every binding spot for oxygen is filled with oxygen, that means we would have 1.34 milliliters of oxygen bound per gram of hemoglobin. This is a constant. We don't always have 100% of our hemoglobin bound. In fact, if we were looking at the venous side, only about 50% at rest of our hemoglobin would be bound with oxygen. So in order to determine how much is actually bound, we multiply the concentration of hemoglobin by that constant, and then we multiply it by the saturation, our percent saturation. Normally for a healthy individual, that's going to be between 95 and 100% saturated at rest. And if you get some disease patients, you might see that go down to around 80% or so. Now, let's say we were 99% saturated. So we put 99% up there. And then you divide it by 100. and that helps all the units come out correctly. So that's how we calculate how much is bound to hemoglobin. Now we also have to calculate how much is floating around in the plasma or dissolved. And this is a really simple calculation. There's a constant here. For every millimeter of mercury of pressure, you get 0.003 milliliters of oxygen dissolved in the blood. So we just find out our partial pressure of oxygen, the PaO2. Let's say it's 100, so we would just do 100 times that, and it's going to end up being like 0.3 milliliters of oxygen dissolved in that 100 mils of blood. Not a whole lot. So the vast majority of our oxygen is going to be transported by being bound to hemoglobin. We'll do a practice on using this formula a little later. So again, CaO2 is the content of oxygen. That's milliliters of oxygen per deciliter of blood, or milliliters of oxygen per 100 milliliters of blood. You'll see it both ways. Okay, so I mentioned that hemoglobin is not always 100% bound with oxygen. What determines how much oxygen is bound to hemoglobin? And the main thing is that partial pressure of oxygen. So if we actually go back, do you remember what determines how much is dissolved in the blood is the partial pressure. But that partial pressure also influences how saturated the blood is. So partial pressure of oxygen is very influential on how much oxygen we transport. So this oxyhemoglobin saturation curve tells us how saturated our hemoglobin will be at a given partial pressure of oxygen. Normally, oxygen can bind, or every heme molecule will bind 4 oxygens. It'll have 4 binding spots. Now, the pressure of oxygen determines how full that heme and the hemoglobin will be. In our arteries, if we were at sea level, San Diego, LA, hanging out on the beach, our partial pressure of oxygen in the arteries is going to be around 100 millimeters of mercury. With that pressure in the arteries, our hemoglobin will be about 100% saturated. Now, in our muscle, if we write muscle down here, muscle is usually somewhere around 30 millimeters of mercury, which means that when the hemoglobin gets down to the muscle, it's only going to be about, man, that was a bad draw. It's only going to be about 30 or 45, 50% saturated, meaning that it lets about 50% of the oxygen off. That might sound like a bad thing, but it's actually it's good. The job of hemoglobin is to pick up oxygen at the lungs and then deliver it, let off the oxygen at the muscles. If hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen was just a straight line up here, it wouldn't matter if you had a partial pressure of 100 or a partial pressure of 0, you wouldn't be able to get the hemoglobin to let go of the oxygen. You deliver the blood down to the muscle, but if this is what the affinity curve looked like, you'd never get the oxygen off the hemoglobin and the muscle would starve and you'd suffocate and it wouldn't be good for you. Fortunately, the hemoglobin loses its affinity for oxygen at low pressures, so it lets some off so the muscle can consume it. Now, remember, the muscle is consuming the oxygen, which drives the pressure down, and it's that driving of the pressure, the low pressure, that allows the oxygen to come off and go into the muscle to be used. So there are a couple of very important features on this curve, and let me double check where I'm at here. One of the important features is that you have a plateau. So let me erase all my dots here. So when we get to the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs, the partial pressure in the lungs and then in the arterial blood is going to be somewhere around 100, 120 millimeters of mercury, depending what you're looking at. The arteries standard is 100 millimeters of mercury. So if we have at San Diego, we're going to have a partial pressure at sea level. We'll have a partial pressure of 100 millimeter mercury. That puts us up there. Now, Provo, we're at a higher elevation. That brings our partial pressure down, and we're going to be somewhere around 90, 95 in our arteries. Look what that does to the saturation. Not a whole lot. This is good for us. We live at 4,000 feet of elevation in Provo, and by going from the beach in Los Angeles to Provo, we're decreasing the partial pressure, but our hemoglobin has enough affinity still that we're mostly saturated. So if we check the saturation of your arterial blood right now, even though you're hanging out here in Provo, it's going to be around 95 to 99% saturated. That's a good thing for us. Now, let's assume that if the curve wasn't a curve, if it was just a straight line. So if this was the relationship here with the red line, if we were in LA, and that's what we had 100% saturation, when we came to Provo, our arterial blood would be less saturated. We'd have less oxygen in our blood, which means less oxygen to deliver to the muscle. So we can't have as much going to the mitochondria, and we would have a low VO2 max, and we'd fatigue really quickly. Fortunately for us, we don't have this linear relationship. The curve is really nice. It protects us against small decreases in pressure due to altitude and other things. Now, another important feature of this, besides the plateau, so there's our plateau, we also have this steep portion right here. This steep portion happens to be around the pressures of the muscle. So if you start to consume oxygen in the level of the muscle, let's just put muscle here again. When you start to consume oxygen, you're dropping down the partial pressure and making it so that the hemoglobin will release the oxygen, making it available for the muscle to consume. If we start to consume more oxygen in the muscle, it drives the pressure down more, and the hemoglobin lets go of more oxygen so it can deliver it and be to the mitochondria and be consumed. This curvilinear relationship is very helpful. It allows hemoglobin to bind oxygen where it needs to be bound and let go of oxygen when it needs to be let go. So let's look at it in another way. I look at hemoglobin as almost like a school bus. Its job is to pick things up in one spot and deliver them and let them off at another. So we have a school bus. The job of the school bus is to pick kids up at the bus stop by all their houses. So at this area, like the lungs, it needs to have a very high affinity for the kids. Get the kids on the bus, or for hemoglobin, get the oxygen on the hemoglobin. But once the bus gets to school, the job of the bus is different. It's not supposed to hold on to the oxygen or hold on to the kids anymore. It needs to let the kids off of the bus so they can go into class. It wouldn't be very wise of a school bus driver to get to the school and leave the door shut, leaving the kids in the bus. They'd probably get arrested, right? You want the kids off the bus. Just like hemoglobin, you want oxygen to load onto the hemoglobin up here at the lungs. At the pressures associated with ambient air and the arterial blood in the lungs, you want hemoglobin to bind the oxygen. But then when you get down to lower pressures associated with the muscle, you want that oxygen to get off the hemoglobin to be delivered where it needs to go. The curvilinear relationship of the curve, that's kind of redundant, right? This curve allows us to do that. The affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen decreases at pressures associated with the muscle, allowing the oxygen to get off. Now, there are a couple of other things. We've kind of beat this part to death. Let me move on here. Let's talk about the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen and how it's affected by exercise. This is a really important principle. So this line in the center, this represents the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen at a normal blood temperature. Right now, your blood sitting there watching this video is probably around 37 degrees Celsius. When you exercise, the muscle starts to produce heat and the blood heats up. If you get to high intensity exercise, you might see 40 degrees in the blood. 42 is probably a lot higher than most people would see during exercise. That's kind of a pathological state. But we'd see the same trend. So let's cross this out and just pretend like it says 40 degrees. So when you exercise and you get hot, the hemoglobin curve shifts to the right. Why would this be beneficial? Well, let's look at the nature of the curve. By shifting to the right, because we have this plateau, when we're in the lungs, shifting, it's not going to affect our saturation at the level of the artery or the lungs. We'll still be able to bind hemoglobin with oxygen and load the school bus, so to speak. But look what happens at the level of the muscle. So let's say our muscle is 30 millimeters of mercury, the pressure of oxygen there. So at rest, at a resting temperature, it would only let go about 50% of the oxygen. So that's like the school bus getting to the school and only letting half of the kids off. When you heat up for exercise, now the hemoglobin lets off 60 to 70% of the oxygen. So the muscle has more oxygen available to it to fuel the exercise. Now on the flip side, if you started to get your blood really cold, now the hemoglobin is going to have more affinity for the oxygen, and it's not going to let as much oxygen off at the level of the muscle. So hot blood means that you let the oxygen off at the muscle. Cold blood would mean that you wouldn't be able to get the oxygen off at the level of the muscle. And fortunately for us, this plateau makes us pretty resilient, that the heat isn't really going to impact our ability to get oxygen onto the hemoglobin because we have that plateau. Now, we have a very similar setup with pH. When you exercise, you get more acidic and the pH goes down. So at rest, you have a pH of about 7.4 in the muscle and the blood, or the blood is about 7.4 usually. Now, when you exercise, you can see that pH in the blood drop down to 7.2, meaning it's more acidic. And we see the same thing happen. We get a shift to the right. And what that means is that for a given pressure at the muscle, the hemoglobin is going to let oxygen off more and allow more oxygen to be consumed by the muscle. This is called the Bohr effect. It's the shift due to the pH. The temperature shift, I'm sure it has a name. I don't know what it is. We can call it the Gifford effect if you want. You can name it after yourself. But this shift to the right allows us to get oxygen off at the muscle and facilitates high VO2s. Now, also in the muscle, you have myoglobin. Myoglobin is kind of like a cousin of hemoglobin. It has a heme on it, but it has a much greater affinity for oxygen at low pressures. So let's say we're at that 30 millimeters of mercury. Actually, let's make it even more intense here. Let's say we get down to a partial pressure of 20 in the muscle. When we get down to that partial pressure in the muscle, the hemoglobin, that's what the blue is, the hemoglobin is going to let all the oxygen off of the hemoglobin. Because myoglobin has such a high affinity for it, it's going to hook up with it. It's going to bind all that oxygen at that low pressure. So it allows the oxygen to move from the blood on the hemoglobin into the muscle on the myoglobin and eventually to the mitochondria to be consumed. So myoglobin has a much greater affinity for oxygen than hemoglobin, and all that just facilitates the movement of oxygen from an area of high pressure, the atmosphere, to an area of low pressure, the muscle with the mitochondria. One thing that you guys might be wondering about, why would I keep drawing the muscle PO2 lower than the venous PO2? It's not an error. The venous PO2, your venous blood, is a mixture of blood from active and inactive tissues that are consuming oxygen and tissues that are not. And so it's generally higher in pressure of oxygen than you'll see right at the active muscle. And so the active muscle, you'll have a lower PO2, which will facilitate greater movement of oxygen. And in inactive muscles, you'll have a higher PO2, which keeps the oxygen from going to places it doesn't need to go. All right. Fiber types. So in terms of fiber type, our slow twitch fibers, the type 1 fibers, have a much greater percentage or a much greater amount of myoglobin because they're all about getting oxygen and aerobic metabolism. That shouldn't surprise you. Now, let's pretend like we're doing a quiz here. Let's calculate the arterial oxygen content given the following data. So again, CaO2 is the content of oxygen in arterial blood. Usually the units are milliliters of oxygen per, why is it doing that? I'm sorry. Per 100 milliliters of blood. So we want to figure out how much oxygen is in 100 milliliters of blood, or a deciliter of blood. So here we are given the following information. We have Leonard, who's 20 years old. He's untrained. He has a hemoglobin concentration of 15 grams per 100 mils of blood, or 15 grams per deciliter. 100 mils is a deciliter. So what we're going to do is we're going to enter in 15 milliliters there. We times the 15 by this constant. You don't have to mess with this. This constant's always there. So 15 times 1.34. And now we look how saturated the arterial blood is. So our hemoglobin saturation in the arterial blood is 96%. So we would put 96 here, divide by the 100. And that's how we calculate how much is bound to the hemoglobin. Next, we take our arterial PO2. So we have a couple of PO2s listed here. We have the PO2 in the air, the PO2 in the alveoli, and the PO2 in the artery. We want the PO2 in the artery because we're looking at blood, right? You don't have blood in the air, so we're going for the arterial blood. If I asked you for the venous content of oxygen, you would look for the PO2 in the vein. So we take this 96 and multiply it by our constant, and we will get a quantity. So it should pop up. Let me do the math on my phone here. So if we take 15 grams per 100 mils times 1.34, and now we times that by 96 and divide that by 100, we're going to get 19.296 milliliters per 100 mils of blood. Now, that's not all of it, right? That's probably 98% of everything, but we also have the dissolved. So to calculate the dissolved, all we need to do is the partial pressure of oxygen, 96, times our constant, which is 0.003 milliliters, and we're going to have 0.288 milliliters per 100 mils of blood. This is milliliters of oxygen. So if we had one of those vials of blood and it's filled up with blood up to 100 mils, we would have 19.296 plus 0.28. So what is this going to be? 0.288 plus 19.296. If I haven't done my math wrong, you should have somewhere around 19.584 milliliters in every 100 milliliters of blood. And that's 19.584 milliliters of oxygen. So inside of this 100 mils of blood, if we took a 100 milliliter sample from your blood, we'd have about 19.5 milliliters of oxygen in it. That's what the content of oxygen is, the CaO2. All right, so you should know this formula, memorize it, and understand how to calculate CaO2, know what factors will affect it. So how would the following factors affect CaO2? That's what we got going on the right side of the screen. So CaO2, how would it be affected by emphysema? In emphysema, you have less alveoli, so it's going to make diffusion hard. Oxygen won't diffuse as well, so you have a lower pressure of oxygen in the blood. So our PaO2 will go down, so we'll have less dissolved, but the PaO2 also influences hemoglobin saturation. So our percent saturation would go down, right? The PaO2 is what dictates this whole curve with percent saturation. So if we have emphysema, instead of being at a PO2 here, we'll be maybe down here and less saturated. So not only will we have less dissolved, we'll have lower saturation and our content will go over. If we have hyperthermia or acidosis, that's going to shift things to the right. And we might, in the artery, will probably not be too affected because of the plateau. We'll still be able to load stuff on. But if you got super acidic, instead of having a shift like that, you might see a shift like this, where you now are less saturated. So you would have less hemoglobin carrying less oxygen if you got very, very acidic. This is like pathological acidity, not just exercise. Carbon monoxide is an interesting one. Carbon monoxide it binds to hemoglobin also. And unfortunately for us, hemoglobin has a much greater affinity for carbon monoxide than it does for oxygen. So when presented with the choice of either binding oxygen or carbon monoxide, it'll bind carbon monoxide. That stinks because when we try to make ATP at the level of the mitochondria don't want to use carbon monoxide. And so if you get all of your hemoglobin bound with carbon monoxide, that essentially takes out this whole part of the equation. Now you have nothing bound, no oxygen bound, and you're forced to try and transport all of your oxygen in the dissolved form. And as you can see, at dissolved form, at normal pressures, we're only getting 0.288 milliliters per 100 mils. That's not a lot of oxygen. So that's why it could be deadly, because you can't transport enough oxygen by just having oxygen dissolved in the blood. So one of the treatments usually for carbon monoxide poisoning is to increase your partial pressure. So carbon monoxide poisoning, if it's super severe, you're going to take this completely out. Okay, you won't be able to transport oxygen on your hemoglobin. So what's done in the hospital is they'll increase the partial pressure. They'll put you in a chamber that is going to be around pure oxygen, and then they'll increase the pressure from being 760 millimeters of mercury, which is your normal room pressure at sea level, and they'll increase it to 2 or 3, 4-fold that, so that it's all pure oxygen. So you have a huge pressure of oxygen. Instead of multiplying by like 96 that we are in this example over here, if you're in a hyperbaric chamber, you might be multiplying by 3,000 or something along those lines. And that allows you to dissolve a lot of oxygen in the blood and at least keep you alive while you're poisoned until the carbon monoxide wears off. All right, so let's end it on this video there. We've talked about oxygen transport. In another video, I'll talk more about CO2 transport and acid-base balance. Those are very related.